Hello everyone. Thank you for coming back to Sleepy History Tales. Imagine an old photograph, a little girl smiling brightly, but her hand is clutching something, a secret that no one can decipher. Today's story takes us to Kentucky, 1893-1895, where Clara Frost, an orphan, is taken into the home of a wealthy man after her mother's mysterious death. Armed with only a photograph, a family heirloom, and old diary entries, a web of crime, greed, and injustice is revealed. Clara holds in her hands not only a keepsake, but also the truth of what happened to her mother, a truth that history thought had been buried. Have you ever wondered if small objects or old photographs can tell us stories that adults have forgotten or hidden? Stay and explore this story with me, where past and present intersect and the truth will finally be heard. Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her glasses as the afternoon light filtered softly through the tall windows of the Louisville Archives. The Kentucky Historical Society had recently acquired a collection of Gerrara photographs from an estate sale in Harlan County, and Sarah had volunteered to catalog them. It was tedious work, yet for her, nothing was more fascinating than sitting quietly before the faces of a century-long past, imagining their lives, their joys, their quiet sorrows. Most of the photographs were what she expected: stiff families in their Sunday-best fathers with thick mustaches and hard gazes, hollow-eyed mothers who had borne too many children, boys and girls forced to remain unnaturally still for long exposures, their faces somewhere between boredom and fear. Then she saw it. A photograph dated March 1895, taken in front of a modest wooden house with a sagging porch and narrow windows. A family of four stood in neat formation: a broad-shouldered man with a heavy mustache and cold eyes, a thin woman whose face seemed carved from worry, a teenage boy with his hands clasped rigidly behind his back, and a girl no older than 10. But it was the girl who made Sarah pause. Unlike the others in the frame, she was smiling, a wide, almost radiant smile that seemed impossibly out of place among the solemn faces. Her dress was plain calico, patched carefully at the elbows, and her dark hair hung in two simple braids tied with fraying ribbon. Her feet were bare despite the chill of early spring, and Sarah almost felt the cold emanating from the photograph. It was her right hand that drew Sarah's attention. Pressed tightly against her stomach, it was clenched into a fist. Knuckles, white fingers curled with tense determination. Leaning closer, her breath fogged the protective glass. The longer she stared, the stranger it became. Why was this child smiling when everyone else was so grave? And what could she be holding so tightly that her small hand formed such a fist? Sarah retrieved her magnifying glass, examining the hand more closely. There was something there. A slight bulge between the fingers, a glint of metal catching the weak sunlight, faint but unmistakable. Her heart raced. 15 years of studying 19th century photographs had taught her to sense when something was off, when a photograph held a secret. She grabbed her notebook, jotting questions down as quickly as they came. The next morning, she spent hours at the county clerk's office, surrounded by dusty ledgers and undigitized property records. The photograph had only a year and a vague Harlan County label, but the house itself was distinctive: 2 stories of weathered clapboard siding, narrow windows with crooked shutters, a stone chimney leaning slightly to the left, as if the whole structure was slowly surrendering to gravity. 3 hours of cross-referencing old tax maps, land deeds, and property transfers revealed the truth. A homestead on Pineville Road, owned in 1895 by a man named Thomas Carver. The deed showed he had purchased it in 1889 for $300, a modest sum even for that era. The name stirred a memory in Sarah. A few clicks later, she accessed the Historical Society's digital archives. Thomas Carver was a local merchant of moderate standing, moderately successful, known for buying land from struggling families during the brutal economic depression of the 1890s. He had accumulated nearly 200 acres before his death in 1904, and the property had passed to his son, who sold most of it during the First World War. But nowhere was there mention of a daughter. Sarah frowned, digging further. Birth records, church registries, census logs, she checked them all. Finally, in the 1895 county census, she found it the Carver household. Thomas, age 41, merchant. Ida, age 38, housewife. James, age 15, laborer. Clara, age 9, orphan, taken in 1893. Her pulse quickened. Clara was not their biological daughter. She had been taken into the household 2 years before the photograph was taken. But from where, for what reason? And most importantly, what had happened to her birth parents? Sarah jotted down the name Clara and looked again at the photograph on her laptop. That brilliant smile, that tightly clenched fist, and she wondered quietly, almost to herself, what was that smile hiding? What secret might that small hand hold a secret? Time itself could not erase. The contrast between the girl and her family was jarring, almost painful to behold. What had happened to her? What secret did she clutch so tightly in her small hand? And why did everyone else in the photograph look so grim while she alone smiled? Sarah grabbed her coat. Harland County was a 4-hour drive through winding mountain roads, but she had to see that house. She had to walk the ground Clara had walked. She had to know. The road to Pineville twisted through dense forests of oak and pine, following creek beds and climbing steep bridges that revealed breathtaking valleys below. Sarah's car rattled over loose gravel. Abandoned coal mines appeared, rusted equipment still in place, and weathered barns sagged under decades of neglect. Small family cemeteries were tucked into the hillsides, their stones tilted, covered in lichen. When she finally found the house, her heart sank. It was still standing, but barely. The porch had collapsed, entirely splintered boards jutting up like broken teeth. Windows were boarded with rotting plywood, and kudzu vines crept up the walls like grasping green fingers, slowly reclaiming the structure. A rusted "No Trespassing" sign swung from a single nail on the ruined front door. Sarah parked on the overgrown driveway and stepped out into the thick, humid air. Cicadas droned in the trees, rising and falling in hypnotic waves. The scent of honeysuckle and decay hung heavy. She approached the house cautiously, her camera swinging gently around her neck. The windows on the ground floor were too high and too well boarded to see inside. But as she circled the property, stepping carefully over fallen branches and rusted farm tools, she noticed something else. A small cemetery plot about 50 yards behind the house, enclosed by a low iron fence, surprisingly intact despite the years. The gate hung open hinges, red with rust. She pushed through shoes, sinking slightly into the soft earth. 4 headstones stood in a neat row. The first 3 were easier to read: Thomas Carver, 1856-1910. Ida Carver, 1858-1922. James Carver, 1880-1952. But the 4th was smaller set, slightly apart, as if even in death Clara had been kept separate. Sarah knelt in the damp grass, brushing away dirt and moss. The inscription was faint, worn smooth by more than a century of rain and wind, but she could just make it out. Clara, 1886-1895. Beloved child, her stomach churned. Clara had died the same year the photograph was taken, only 9 years old. And yet, the word beloved felt hollow, a lie carved in stone. Sarah took several photographs, then stood and looked back toward the ruined house. Its empty windows stared at her like blind eyes. Something terrible had happened here. She could feel it in her bones. Returning to town, she stopped at the Harlan County Public Library, a small brick building on Main Street that also served as a community center and local history museum. The librarian, a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, looked up from her desk as Sarah entered the bell above the door, jingling softly. "Can I help you find something?" the librarian asked, her accent thick with the musical lilt of Appalachia. "I'm researching a family that lived here in the 1890s, Sarah said, carefully setting the printed photograph on the desk. "The Carvers. Thomas and Ida Carver. Do you know anything about them?" The woman's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around her eyes, a faint downturn of her mouth, but it was enough for Sarah to notice. She set down her pen and picked up the photograph, studying it with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of history. "Thomas Carver," she said slowly, her voice measured. "I've heard the name. My grandmother used to talk about him when I was a girl. Said he was a hard man, ambitious, not well liked, but respected. The way wealthy men are respected even when they shouldn't be." And the girl Sarah asked, pointing to Clara with her enormous smile and clenched fist. "She was an orphan?" the librarian said quietly, taken in by the family in 1893, according to the census. Sarah leaned back, studying the woman's face. Taken in? But from where? And what had she endured in that house to force such a smile and such a grip? The librarian's gaze lingered on Clara's face in the photograph, and for a moment, something like sadness flickered across her features. "There were rumors," she said quietly, glancing toward the empty library as though afraid someone might overhear. "Back then, orphans didn't have legal rights, no protection. They were useful, if you understand my meaning." Sarah shivered despite the warm afternoon. "Useful how?" "Labor," the woman said, bluntly, meeting her eyes. "Farm work, housework, anything that needed doing." She hesitated, then added, "They weren't taken in out of Christian charity or love. They were free hands. Extra workers who couldn't complain, leave or demand wages. Some families treated them decently enough. Others..." She trailed off, shaking her head. Sarah's mind raced. She thought again of Clara's smile, so bright, so wrong, and the fist that clutched something precious or dangerous, or perhaps both. "Is there anyone still alive who might remember that time?" Sarah asked gently. "Anyone who might have known the Carvers or heard stories about them?" The librarian paused clearly, weighing something, then nodded slowly. "There's a man. Henry Pike. He's 93. Now lives at the Maplewood Care Home just outside town. His grandmother was a midwife here in the 1890s. Delivered most of the babies in 3 counties. She kept detailed journals of her work, of the families she served. Henry donated most of them to the Historical Society years ago, but he might still have some. And his memory is sharp." Sarah's heart leapt. "Can you give me his address?" The librarian scribbled it down on a scrap of paper. "Tell him Ruth sent you," she said, "and tell him it's about remembering the ones who were forgotten." Henry Pike sat in a wheelchair by the window of his room at Maplewood. A patchwork quilt draped over his lap, sunlight streaming through the glass, illuminating motes of dust drifting lazily in the air. His eyes were cloudy with cataracts, yet his mind was remarkably sharp, his voice rough but steady as he greeted Sarah. When she explained why she had come, showing him the photograph and telling him about Clara's grave, he nodded slowly. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he took the picture. "My grandmother, Eliza," he said, staring at Clara's face. "She delivered half the babies in this county between 1875 and 1920. She saw things, knew things. People trusted her with their secrets, their fears, their shame. She understood her work wasn't just about bringing children into the world. It was about bearing witness." "Did she ever mention the Carvers?" Sarah asked, pulling a chair closer. Henry's jaw tightened. The muscles beneath his skin worked like brittle leather. "She did," he said, voice low, almost bitter. Not fondly, not kindly. He wheeled over to a small wooden chest in the corner, its surface scarred with age. With effort, he opened it and pulled out a leather-bound journal. Pages yellowed and brittle. The binding cracked. He handled it reverently, then handed it carefully to Sarah. She wrote about a girl, he whispered, an orphan living with the Carvers. I remember reading about her years ago when I first went through my grandmother's journals. Broke my heart then. Still does. Sarah opened the journal carefully, mindful of its fragility. The handwriting was cramped and faded, precise, practical. She flipped slowly until she found an entry dated February 18th, 1895. Called to the Carver home today for the girl Clara. She had a fever and a terrible cough. Mrs. Carver said she had been working outside in the cold rain, without proper clothing, fetching water from the creek because the well had run dry. The child is thin as a willow branch, her hands raw and cracked from scrubbing floors and doing laundry in cold water. I asked if she was being fed enough. Mrs. Carver did not answer. Thomas stood in the doorway the entire time I was there, filling the room with a presence like a threat. I do not trust that man. There was something cold in Thomas Carver, something calculating. Sarah could feel it through the words of the journal. She feared for this child. Her hands trembled as she turned the page. Another entry dated March 10th, 1895. Saw Clara in town today, near the general store. She was carrying 2 heavy buckets of water, her shoulders bent under the weight. When she saw me, she smiled a bright, unexpected smile that startled me. I gave her a biscuit I had been saving. She took it and immediately hid it in her dress pocket, glancing around as if afraid it would be taken from her. She thanked me in a whisper and hurried away. I fear deeply for this child. There is something wrong in that house. Sarah looked up at Henry, her throat tight. What happened to her? She died, Henry said quietly, his cloudy eyes distant, filled with memory. Just a few weeks after that last entry, my grandmother made. March 28th, 1895. They said it was pneumonia. That's what the county physician recorded in the church registry. She was buried in the family plot. But Sarah heard the doubt in his voice. The unspoken questions. "You don't believe it was pneumonia?" she asked softly, more a whisper than a question. Henry was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the distant mountains. "I don't know what I believe," he finally said. "But I know my grandmother didn't believe it." He reached forward and turned the pages for her, stopping at an entry dated March 30th, 1895. The handwriting here was different, shakier, more emotional. "Clara is dead. They say pneumonia, but I do not believe it. I examined her body when they sent for me to prepare her for burial. There were no signs of the fluid in the lungs that accompanies pneumonia. Her body bore marks, bruises, old and new. This child was not loved. She was not cherished. And now she is gone and no one will ask questions because she was only an orphan, and orphans do not matter to people like the Carvers. May God forgive us all for our silence." Sarah closed the journal carefully, hands shaking. Tears burned her eyes. She looked at Henry. "No one investigated. No one cared enough to," he said simply. "That's how it was then. That's how it's always been. For children who don't matter to the right people." But Sarah's mind was already racing. Clara had mattered. She had mattered enough to hide something in her clenched fist. Something important enough to hold on to even when being photographed, even when surrounded by the very people who had failed her. "Thank you," Sarah said, softly rising. "Thank you for sharing this with me. Find out what happened to her," Henry said, wheeling toward the window. "Give her the voice she never had." Sarah nodded. "I will." Back in her hotel room that night, Sarah spread everything across the desk. The photograph copies of census records, notes from conversations, photographs of Clara's grave. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat under the harsh light of the desk lamp, studying the photograph once more. She pulled out her high-powered magnifying lens, the kind used by art historians and document examiners, and focused on Clara's clenched fist. With the magnification, the object hidden between her fingers became unmistakable metallic oval-shaped with delicate decorative edging. A brooch, Sarah's mind raced. Why would a poor orphan dressed in patched calico with bare feet have a brooch? Such items were luxury goods, often silver or gold, sometimes adorned with precious stones or enamel. They were heirlooms, symbols of status and love. Where had Clara gotten it, and why hide it? Why hold it so tightly that her knuckles whitened even as she was forced to smile for the camera? Determined to find answers, Sarah opened her laptop and dove back into historical records. She focused on 1893, the year Clara had been taken in by the Carvers. She combed through newspaper archives, death notices, court records, anything that might explain where this orphan girl had come from. 2 hours later, eyes burning from the strain, she found it buried in the back pages of the Harlan County Gazette, dated November 16th, 1893. Local woman found dead. Foul play suspected. Mrs. Rebecca Frost, aged 28, discovered deceased in her home on Mill Creek Road on the evening of November 14th. The report chilled Sarah to the bone. Mrs. Frost's body had been discovered by a neighbor who hadn't seen her for several days. Authorities noted signs of a violent struggle inside the home. Her young daughter, believed to be around 7 years old, was missing. Sheriff Morton had announced that an investigation was ongoing, urging anyone with information to come forward immediately. Sarah's heart pounded as she scrolled to the next edition dated November 30th, 1893. Orphan child recovered. Taken in by a local family. The daughter of the late Mrs. Rebecca Frost has been located and placed with the family of Mr. Thomas Carver of Pineville Road, who has graciously agreed to provide for the child's welfare and upbringing. The investigation into Mrs. Frost's death continues, though no suspects have been identified. The child, deeply traumatized, is reportedly recovering under the care of the Carver family. Sarah sat back, her blood running cold. Clara had been Rebecca Frost's daughter, and Rebecca Frost had been murdered violently in her own home just weeks before Clara was placed with the Carvers. But the newspaper said the investigation was ongoing. Yet nothing followed. No arrests, no justice. The story had simply vanished from public record, erased, as if it had never mattered except perhaps to the one person who couldn't forget her daughter. Sarah's hands shook as she called the Kentucky Historical Society's research desk. "I need everything you have on Rebecca Frost," she said urgently. "Death records, property records, anything. And Thomas Carver, every document, every mention. I need it all, and I need it now." Because now, she understood something that made her chest ache with both rage and sorrow. Clara hadn't just been holding a brooch in that photograph. She had been holding her mother's brooch. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had been holding the only piece of evidence that could reveal who had killed Rebecca Frost. The only piece of evidence pointing to the man who had taken her in, not out of kindness, but to keep her silent. The documents arrived by courier the next morning, filling 2 large archive boxes. Sarah spread them across the hotel bed, beginning the painstaking work of piecing together the story. Property deeds, tax records, court filings, personal correspondence, a paper trail of 2 lives that had intersected with deadly consequences. Rebecca Frost had been a widow, left with a small but valuable plot of 35 acres creek access and good timber after her husband William Frost died in a mining accident in 1891. She had managed the property herself for 2 years, selling timber rights to maintain a modest, independent living. Court records showed she had successfully defended her land against a claim from a distant relative in 1892. But what gripped Sarah most were the letters. Copies preserved in county files as part of legal proceedings. Beginning in early 1893, Thomas Carver had written repeatedly to Rebecca Frost, offering increasingly generous sums for her land. Polite but persistent, each letter stressed how difficult it must be for a woman alone to manage such property and how he could provide security. Rebecca had refused every offer. Her responses were formal, carefully worded, and resolute. The land was her daughter's inheritance. She would hold it until Clara came of age. No sum of money would persuade her to sell. The final letter from Thomas Carver was dated October 15, 1893, less than a month before Rebecca was found dead. The tone had shifted. Persuasive words had turned into veiled threats. "I must urge you to reconsider. Mrs. Frost, a woman and child alone, are vulnerable to many dangers in these isolated hills. It would be a tragedy if something were to happen that could have been prevented through more prudent decision-making." Sarah's hands clenched the paper. Not an explicit threat, nothing a court could use, but the meaning was clear enough. 3 weeks later, Rebecca Frost was dead. And according to property records filed in January 1894, her 35 acres had been transferred to Thomas Carver. The deed listed the transaction as a settlement of debts, yet no price was ever indicated. It had been processed through the county probate court as part of Rebecca Frost's estate settlement, but Rebecca had no debts. The records showed she was current on her taxes, owed nothing to merchants' banks or anyone. Sarah pulled out another document, the probate record itself. It was perfunctory, processed quickly with minimal review. The presiding judge, Howard Langley, appeared repeatedly in other records as a business partner of Thomas Carver in several land ventures. Corruption was woven through every document, every transaction. The truth was undeniable. Rebecca Frost had been murdered for her land. Her daughter had been taken in by her mother's killer, not as an act of charity, but as a way to legitimize the theft, to appear benevolent while keeping any potential witness under his control. But Clara had known. Even as a 7-year-old, she had understood what had happened, and she had held on to something, her mother's brooch, as evidence, as memory, as the one fragile link to the truth. Sarah stared at the photograph again. That radiant smile was a mask. That clenched fist was defiance, preservation, silent protest. She thought of Clara living for 2 years under the same roof as her mother's killer, forced to call him a benefactor, unable to speak, unable to escape until she died at 9 years old. Her secrets had been buried with her, or so everyone believed. Determined, Sarah drove to the old Presbyterian church on the southern edge of Harland County. A white clapboard building with a tall steeple. It had been converted into a community center in the 1970s. But the original records, births, deaths, marriages, pastoral correspondences dating back to 1875 were still stored in the basement, carefully preserved. The volunteer archivist, a retired school teacher named Ruth Ann, led Sarah down narrow stairs into the basement. "We've got everything organized by year," she said, pulling a chain to light a bare bulb that revealed rows of metal filing cabinets. Church correspondence is filed separately from the registries. "What year are you looking for?" 1895. March. Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ruth Ann pulled open a drawer labeled 1890, 1900, then a folder marked March 1895. "You can work at that table," she said, pointing to a scarred wooden table beneath the light. "Handle everything carefully." Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were pastoral letters, reports to the church, council records of home visits, and correspondence with neighboring churches. Methodically, she scanned each one for any mention of Clara or the Carver family. 3/4 of the way through, she found it a letter, dated March 15, 1895, written in the careful hand of Reverend Samuel Holt. It had never been sent. Instead, it was filed away, perhaps as a record, perhaps as insurance, perhaps as testimony he hoped would never be needed. "To whom it may concern, I write this with a heavy and troubled heart, praying I am wrong in my suspicions, but fearing I am not. Yesterday, March 14th, a child in my congregation came to me in secret. Clara, the orphan girl residing with the Carvers, was frightened, trembling, and spoke of things no child should know or carry. She told me that her mother did not die by accident, nor by an unknown intruder. She claimed to know who killed her mother, though she would not speak the name aloud. When I pressed her, she looked at me with eyes far too old for her young face and said, 'He took everything. He took Mama, and then he took me.' She showed me a brooch, a small silver piece with a blue stone, her mother's most precious possession. Inside it was hidden a folded piece of paper, a letter she said her mother had written before her death. She would not let me read it, but she claimed it contained the truth naming the man who threatened her mother and stole their land. I urged her to give it to the sheriff to let me accompany her and help her speak. But she is terrified. She believes no one will listen to an orphan child, especially one beholden to a man of Mr. Carver's standing. She fears speaking will bring harm to herself, and she may be right. I have prayed long through the night for guidance. I promised Clara I would keep her secret until she is ready to speak. But I fear for her safety. I fear that the man who would kill a woman for her land would not hesitate to silence a child who threatens to expose him. If anything should happen to this child, if she falls ill, if she suffers an accident, if she dies under suspicious circumstances, let this letter serve as testimony. Let it be known she came to me, that she told me she knew the truth and that she feared the man now claiming to care for her. May God forgive me if my silence leads to harm. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in her hands. Clara had tried. She had tried to speak, to expose the truth. She had gone to the one person who might have helped her, and Reverend Holt had wanted to. His anguish and uncertainty were woven into every line. 2 weeks later, Sarah confirmed in the church registry Clara was dead. The entry was brief. March 28, 1895, Clara, age 9, caused pneumonia. Buried. March 30th, family plot Carver property. Reverend Holt had added a final note in cramped handwriting in the margin. May God forgive us for what we failed to prevent. Sarah carefully photographed both the letter and the registry entry. She thanked Ruth Ann and stepped into the late afternoon sun, her mind racing. Clara had the evidence. She had held it in that photograph, literally in her clenched fist, her mother's brooch, the hidden letter, inside naming Thomas Carver. But where was it now Clara had died? Had the brooch been buried with her, or had someone taken it? Sarah pulled out her phone. She had to find it. If the brooch and its hidden letter still existed after more than 130 years, Clara could finally speak, the truth could finally be heard, and justice, however delayed, might at last be served. Sarah returned to Louisville, throwing herself into work with relentless intensity. For a week, she labored 18 hours a day, compiling everything she had uncovered into a meticulous, comprehensive report. The photograph that had started it all. Eliza's journal entries documenting Clara's mistreatment. The property records revealing the theft of Rebecca Frost's land. Newspaper articles describing Rebecca's murder and the stalled investigation. Letters between Rebecca and Thomas Carver. Reverend Holt's account of Clara's secret visit. The suspicious death certificate listing pneumonia when a midwife had recorded otherwise. Methodically, Sarah built the story, connecting patterns, motives, and opportunity across decades. She submitted her report to the Kentucky Historical Society, formally recommending that Clara's death be reopened as a historical investigation, and that Rebecca Frost's murder be re-examined in light of this new evidence. Within days, the story spread. The Louisville Courier-Journal picked it up, followed by the Lexington Herald-Leader, and soon regional outlets across Kentucky and Tennessee. The photograph of Clara, a child forced to smile while clutching a hidden secret, became the center of conversation. Historical justice children denied of voice crimes buried beneath the polished veneer of respectability. Social media amplified it. Historians, genealogists, true crime, enthusiasts and advocates for children's rights shared the story, adding context, research, and commentary. A crowdfunding campaign to restore Clara's grave was launched and reached its goal within 3 hours. Then came the breakthrough Sarah had been hoping for. A woman named Patricia from Lexington emailed the Historical Society. Her grandmother had been an antiques dealer in Harlan County during the 1950s. Among her estate items was a collection of jewelry, catalogued slowly over decades. One piece, a small silver brooch with an oval blue stone Victorian in style. Delicate filigree edging caught Patricia's attention when she saw the viral story. According to her grandmother's records, it had been purchased at an estate sale in 1952 when the last of the Carver property was liquidated after James Carver's death. Could this be Clara's brooch? The next day, Sarah drove to Lexington, heart pounding. Patricia welcomed her warmly, understanding the weight of what might be in her hands. She opened a small velvet box and revealed the brooch. The moment Sarah saw it, she knew. Its size, shape, the light-catching blue stone, it matched perfectly. Patricia carefully opened the brooch's back clasp. Inside was a hidden compartment, and there it was, a folded piece of paper, yellowed, fragile, barely larger than a postage stamp. With Patricia's permission, Sarah unfolded it under the light. The handwriting faded, but legible was unmistakably Rebecca Frost's. If anything happens to me, let it be known, Thomas Carver has threatened me repeatedly. He wants my land and will not accept my refusal. He came to my home today and said that women who don't listen to reason often meet with accidents. He said my daughter would be better off with a proper family who understands reality. I am afraid. I am alone, but I will not sell. This land is Clara's inheritance, and I will protect it with my life if necessary. If I am found dead, look to Thomas Carver. He is not what he seems. He is not a good man. Clara, if you're reading this, know that I loved you more than anything in this world. Fight for what is yours. Fight for the truth. Sarah's vision blurred with tears. This was it, the evidence Clara had protected with every ounce of her being. The truth her mother had written, knowing she might die. The accusation that had lain hidden for 132 years. Waiting. Patricia insisted the brooch and letter be donated immediately to the Kentucky Historical Society. Within hours, archivists and forensic document experts confirmed its authenticity, the paper consistent with 1890 stock, the ink matching the period, the handwriting definitively Rebecca Frost's matching perfectly with county records. The story exploded. National news picked it up. Major networks ran the photographs, the letters, the brooch. Finally, Clara's secret, the crime buried under decades of silence, could be told. Finally, a voice long denied could speak. The story reached far beyond Kentucky. The New York Times ran a front-page feature. Documentary filmmakers reached out. But more importantly, it sparked a wider conversation about historical accountability, about the crimes hidden behind respectability, about the children who had been silenced. The Kentucky Historical Society convened a special panel of historians, legal scholars, and genealogists to examine the case thoroughly. While Thomas Carver could not be prosecuted long dead for 120 years, the panel issued a formal historical finding. By the preponderance of evidence, he had murdered Rebecca Frost to acquire her land, taken her daughter to silence potential testimony, and legitimize his theft and Clara had died under suspicious circumstances, while in his care likely killed to prevent her ever speaking the truth she carried. The finding was published, distributed to libraries, and historical societies entered into the permanent record. Thomas Carver's name, once linked with prosperity and civic leadership, was forever tied to murder theft and the death of a child. Rebecca Frost's 35 acres. The land that had cost 2 lives were traced through decades of property records. When current owners learned its history, they agreed to allow a memorial. A simple stone marker was placed near the creek Rebecca and Clara Frost murdered for refusing to surrender. Remembered for refusing to forget. Clara's grave was restored. The small, lonely headstone replaced with polished granite inscribed Clara Frost, 1886-1895, daughter of Rebecca Frost. She held the truth when no one else would listen. She protected her mother's words until they could finally be heard. Her silence was never surrender. It was survival. Her voice, though delayed, has now spoken. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds, historians, advocates, descendants of families who had lost land, and school children learning Clara's story. Sarah stood by the grave as a pastor prayed, a children's choir sang, and the sun fell gently across the restored monument. Holding the photograph that had begun it all, she spoke. Clara was 9 years old when she died. She lived only 2 years with the man who murdered her mother. 2 years of knowing the truth, carrying it, unable to speak without risking everything. She went to her pastor for help. He wanted to, but he was afraid. We were all afraid throughout history to stand up for children with no power, no protection, no voice. But Clara never let go. In that photograph, surrounded by those who took everything from her, she smiled, not because she was happy, but because she was strong. She held onto her mother's brooch, the only evidence she could protect, even when it meant she could not relax, not for a single moment. Her voice grew firm, carrying across the cemetery. This story isn't just about the past. It's about every child who knows something is wrong, but doesn't know how to speak. It's about listening, believing, and protecting them. Clara waited 132 years for someone to see what she was really saying, not just with her smile, but with her fist. She was saying, I remember, I know, and someday you will know too. Today we finally hear her. Today Clara Frost speaks, and we will never forget her voice. 6 months later, the photograph hung in a place of honor at the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfurt, behind museum-grade glass with carefully controlled lighting. The exhibit, Hidden Truths, Children's Voices in American History, made Clara's image the centerpiece. Surrounding it were reproductions of Rebecca Frost's letters, copies of documents Sarah had uncovered the brooch in a secure display, and the text of the hidden letter Clara had carried. Visitors paused to read. School groups studied. Teachers incorporated her story into lessons on Reconstruction era, America Orphan Rights, and women's property rights. Clara had become more than a victim. She was a symbol of resilience, of truth, surviving the silence imposed by the powerful. Sarah visited often. She had written a book, The Clenched Fist. How one photograph revealed a 132-year-old murder, a bestseller that inspired new generations of researchers to seek out the forgotten, marginalized, and silenced. More than the recognition, more than the book, Sarah treasured the letters she received from adoptive families, moved to learn their children's histories from social workers placing Clara's photograph in offices as a reminder, from survivors of childhood abuse who drew courage from the knowledge that truth, however delayed, can endure. One letter stood out. A teacher from Harland County had taken her 5th grade class to Clara's grave. Each student had written a note to Clara, apologizing, promising to remember her, and pledging to become the kind of people who listen to children in need. And in those letters, in the restored monument, in the exhibit, in every photograph and document, Clara's voice finally had been heard. The letters were placed in a waterproof box and buried near the memorial stone, a time capsule of compassion reaching back across the centuries. Today, Sarah stands before the exhibit, once more watching a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, about Clara's age, stare intently at the photograph. The girl's mother reads the placard aloud in a quiet voice. When they finish, the girl doesn't move. She keeps staring at Clara's face, at that smile, at that clenched fist. Finally, she looks up at her mother. Did it hurt? Holding on that tight for so long, the mother replies thoughtfully. Probably. But sometimes, holding on is the bravest thing we can do. The girl nods slowly, reaching out to touch the glass with her small hand, fingers spread over Clara's image. I'm glad someone finally listened to you, she whispers. Sarah feels her throat tighten. This is why the work matters. This is why uncovering the past is never just about history. It's about connection, about recognition, about ensuring suffering is acknowledged, so that maybe incrementally, the world becomes a place where such suffering happens less often. She thinks of the journey that began with a single photograph in a dusty archive, about following curiosity and outrage until it unraveled a story deliberately buried, about Clara, who at 9 had more courage than most adults who had understood that some truths are worth protecting even when protection costs everything. The photograph no longer fills Sarah with sadness, though the sorrow remains embedded in every pixel. Now it brings a fierce pride in Clara's strength in Eliza, the midwife who documented what she saw, in Reverend Hall who wrote his letter. Despite fear and pride in all who preserved these fragments, the photograph, the journals, the letters, the brooch, never knowing that someday someone would assemble them into truth. Clara's smile is no longer innocence or happiness. It is defiance, determination. Her way of saying, you can take everything else, but you cannot take this. You cannot make me forget. You cannot silence the truth I carry. Her clenched fist gripping her mother's brooch and words is no longer just detail in a photograph. It is a declaration. Resistance. Hope. Clara had known something her killers had, not that truth is patient. Evidence carefully protected can wait. A photograph meant to show a respectable family adopting an orphan could, if examined by someone who cared, reveal something entirely different. Reveal captivity, reveal resistance, reveal crime. The young girl and her mother move on. But Sarah lingers, gazing at Clara's face, at those eyes that had seen too much, at the smile that was a mask, at the fist that had held on through everything. You did it, Sarah whispers to the photograph. To the girl who died 132 years ago, but who is somehow more alive now than ever. You held on long enough. Your mother's words reached us. Your truth reached us. We heard you, Clara. Finally, we heard you. In the controlled lighting of the museum, the afternoon sun streaming through distant windows, Clara's photograph seems almost to glow. That smile, once mysterious and troubling, now reads as triumph. Clara had won. She had protected her mother's truth through fear and oppression. She had held the evidence safe even when she couldn't use it herself. She had held on literally and figuratively until her hands went white, until her body gave out, until death claimed her, but death hadn't claimed her story. Her courage, or the truth she protected. 132 years later, the world finally knew. Thomas Carver had taken Rebecca Frost's life and land. He had taken Clara's childhood and ultimately her life. He had believed he could bury the truth as easily as he buried his victims. But he had underestimated the power of a mother's words, a daughter's love, and the persistence of truth. And in the end, Clara Frost, once silenced by violence, fear, and death itself had spoken. Her story, once buried, is now taught, remembered, and honored. She is no longer the forgotten orphan girl who died alone. She is Clara Frost, daughter of Rebecca Keeper, of truth, holder of justice. And that clenched fist, frozen forever in 1895, is no longer a mystery. It is a promise kept.